Hi everyone, and thank you for joining us today for the third in our series of oil and gas CPD webinars for in-house lawyers. If you weren't able to join us for the first two sessions, then don't worry, because we're going to be sending out recordings of all four webinars following our final session tomorrow. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Laura and I'm a director here at Burness Paul, and I'm going to be hosting today's session. Today we're going to be hearing from Peter Ward and Neil Bruce, who are going to be giving an overview of the current renewable sector, the opportunities and challenges for the oil and gas sector, and the race to net zero. Following Peter and Neil's presentation, there should hopefully be time for a short Q&A session. So please do send any questions that you may have in via the chat function for our speakers. So by way of introduction, Peter is a partner in our corporate team with a particular focus on energy transactions. Peter regularly provides advice to developers, banks, power generators, investment funds, and utilities in respect of the financing, procurement, and construction of energy projects, grid connection arrangements, joint ventures, and power purchase agreements. And Peter is going to be joined today by Neil, who is a partner in our commercial property team. And Neil has a particular interest in renewable energy projects. He has significant experience acting for both developers and funders in connection with renewable energy developments across a range of technologies, including onshore wind, offshore wind, and solar projects. So over to you, Peter and Neil.
Great, thanks Laura, and hi everyone. Thanks very much for joining us today. Neil and I very much welcome the opportunity to speak to you all. We hope you find our overview of the renewable energy sector in Scotland useful, both in terms of commercial awareness, key market trends, challenges and opportunities, but also hopefully with an understanding that the renewable sector and the makeup of a renewable energy project is probably not too dissimilar to what you all have experience of in your day-to-day roles and the work you've been doing in the oil and gas sector. I know it definitely surprised some of our own E&P team over the last few months as we've been discussing, or last year or so discussing with them, offshore wind and other new emerging technologies and walking through how these projects work. And definitely a few parallels and a few light bulb moments of, well, that's not too different from what we know. So hopefully we can dispel some of those myths today. But by way of background, I'm sure you're all aware and familiar with our firm's oil and gas practice. This presentation does come at a kind of exciting time for the firm. Pre-COVID, the firm had started to refocus its proposition in light of energy transition, the efforts of our oil and gas clients, and as operators in the supply chain started to grapple with challenges of a low carbon future and new opportunities. We're trying to be more closely aligned with our renewable energy practice, where Neil and I have worked over the years. I think for the last decade, where Neil and I have supported clients who happen to be kind of international front runners across the spectrum of sustainable and renewable technologies. And the kind of third limb to that, bringing our teams together more closely, is looking actually at our wider client base, not specific energy clients, but energy users, looking at issues around climate change, net zero, lowering carbon emissions, ESG agenda, and engaging with clients across sectors such as food and drink, house building, heavy manufacturing, in order to understand the impact that these types of issues and the need for energy are having on their businesses. So our presentation today, I think, will hopefully cover off and touch some of these areas, and we very much look forward to any questions you might have at the end. I suppose the best place to start then is with regards to the current trends and what we're seeing in the renewable energy sector. And I think, like every other sector, it hasn't been immune to the impact of COVID and the pandemic. It's presented a significant challenge to the sector. Certainly this time last year, there was a slight pause on a lot of projects. Construction programs were affected, and some developers kind of took stock of where they are. But I think Neil and I have discussed it quite a lot recently. We've been very lucky in the last year that the renewables sector just quickly got going again. And we had a really, really busy year with a number of kind of M&A projects, a number of financing, and a raft of new projects across a range of technologies coming forward. But I think what COVID demonstrated to the sector, I think, and also the population, is the government need to respond to a crisis. And we have these almost extreme and unthinkable measures of lockdown and billions of pounds of bailouts and the furlough scheme that has shown how to deal with a crisis. And I think climate change is up there. It's highlighted as a kind of existential crisis, but I think a large part of the population to date, maybe it's something for future generations to worry about. It's not really been tackled properly by government, but now on the back of COVID and the work of, I guess, activists like Greta Thunberg and David Attenborough, it's very much in the public consciousness. And then we have COP26 coming in Glasgow this year, which has brought climate change really to the front of the agenda. Net zero and our targets sit alongside things like Brexit, the NHS, NDREF2 in the sort of current media and political space. And Scottish Government are saying, with part of the economic recovery plan, that the green economy will be at the forefront of any rebuilding of the economy. So I think it's a really interesting and exciting time for the whole energy sector, of which renewables is only a small part. So that's kind of where we are in the grand scheme of things in terms of targets. You'll all know that we have really testing and stretching net zero targets. The immediate one in the kind of short to medium term is a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 68% by 2030, rising to 100% by 2050. And an awful lot of work has been done to date in decarbonising our electricity sector, including the growth in renewables. And there are definite success stories that I think the UK can point to. But there's so much more work to be done, including in respect of heat and transport, which account for far more of our energy consumption than just producing electricity. We're only really scratching the surface on these at the moment, and the Climate Change Committee and various other kind of government reports are highlighting that there is so much more work to be done on these sectors. But going back to that point, I think COVID has shown us how to tackle a huge challenge to society. And I think we're now in that phase where government are really beginning to grapple with this. We're now looking forward, and we may hopefully see the sort of policies, the reform and the regulation really kick-started in order to drive this forward. I mentioned renewable energy there and decarbonisation of electricity generation. It's a success story. It's been built up over many years, and I'll just pass over to Neil, who can give you an overview of some of the trends within the renewable sector set against the kind of background of net zero and climate change.
Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. So, yeah, in terms of the market, in terms of renewable electricity generation, incredibly strong and very busy for us over the last 18 to 24 months. And I think a lot of you will probably be aware of the growth in the area over the last maybe 10 to 12 years or so. We did see a period of kind of relative slowdown around the time of the removal of the renewables obligation subsidy regime. And I think it's fair to say it's taken a bit longer for some of the offshore wind projects to progress to where those are now. But what we're seeing at the moment is strong development activity across a number of technologies, and I thought we'd just run through a number of those in a brief overview of the key ones. So onshore wind, probably there's the most prominent technology in Scotland. What we are seeing is a strong focus again on onshore wind development, and that's coming mainly from larger and utility scale developers as opposed to the more sort of smaller medium-sized players that kind of flooded the market back in the days of the RO. And I think the nature of those involved is down to a number of factors, including the fact that until recently there appeared to be no subsidy for onshore wind. Developers were looking at modelling their projects based on merchant power prices, and assuming no government support makes it difficult to get external finance for projects. And the result of that is that projects having to be funded off balance sheet. So it's not really a surprise that what we've seen is the likes of Scottish Power Renewables, EDF Renewables, Statkraft, Vattenfall, BayWa, and several others. They are the ones that have got the sort of widely publicised aims to really develop and grow their onshore wind portfolios, and that's what they're doing at the moment. You might be aware, actually, it has been announced that onshore wind has been brought back into the subsidy regime, which is called the Contract for Difference, or CFD regime, and Peter will touch on that a bit later. That's expected to assist with project viability, but as I say, that there are other routes to market. So, you know, developers modelling on a subsidy-free basis, and you also probably see developers entering into corporate power purchase agreements with many with blue chip organisations, so the likes of Nestle, Facebook, Amazon. You'll have seen that. But just to be clear, the corporate PPA route, that's not unique to onshore wind, and we see that across all of the technologies that we work on. Moving to offshore wind, again, as I say, there's a significant period of time where offshore wind was actually quite slow moving, and a lot of that was down to the expensive nature of the technology, project costs involved, also partly down to the impact of the RSPB legal challenge to consent that was granted to Nartnaguia, which is an NNG project, Inchcape and the Seagreen project. But over the last couple of years, we've seen various Scottish projects have succeeded in reaching financial close, moved into construction and operations. So you're probably familiar with Beatrice, Moray East, NNG, and obviously Seagreen 1, which was this last year. There's also other projects from the same kind of round of development. So Inchcape I mentioned, Moray West, and the other parts of Seagreen, they're all continuing their development process and seeking a route to market, and probably expect them to come online in the next couple of years. And also, in addition to that, there's a new round of offshore wind leasing that's ongoing. That's the ScotWind process. And I'll say a bit more about that later in the presentation. Generally speaking, offshore wind's a huge opportunity, and the Scottish Government's ambition is to develop and deliver up to 11 gigawatts of onshore wind capacity by 2030. So huge in scale, if you think about it. And then solar, it's the next one, just not really a technology you'd immediately associate with Scotland, but we have seen more positive movements in the right direction with solar development recently. I think we have to recognise you're not going to see the same levels of deployment that you get, for example, in the south of England, and lack of subsidy has been an issue for solar development, so margins are really tight and challenging. But our recent experience on solar is more around sort of more innovative private wire solutions, on-site generation, that kind of idea, rather than commercial scale solar farm development. But it's definitely something that we see a bit of an uptick in. Energy storage, again, something that we're seeing increased activity in. And actually, if we go back 2 or 3 years, we saw a number of developers looking at energy storage projects. Often they weren't taken forward, and that was primarily because they couldn't make the revenue streams stack up, and they couldn't make projects viable, and as a result of that, nobody wanted to lend money to it, so finance couldn't really be obtained. But certainly in my practice, from a property perspective, we've seen a lot more focus, a lot of advancements over the last 6 to 9 months, keener focus again on energy storage, whether that's co-located with another technology like onshore wind, and also quite a few clients looking at the upcoming National Grid ESO Stability Pathfinder process, which is essentially a process which will allow balancing of the grid. So the country's going to rely less on conventional power plants, and those sorts of processes are going to use storage to help deal with that. Quickly touching on energy from waste, again, we've seen advancements in EFW development over the last couple of years. We've been involved in a number of projects in that space. Although in Scotland, you do have competition for fuel sources, so there is a limit on what can be developed. But again, more focus and more project delivery is what we're seeing there. You guys obviously all work within the oil and gas sector, so I thought it was worth touching upon moves that we've seen a number of oil and gas companies make into the renewables field, which obviously hasn't been surprising given the sector's expertise in delivering offshore-based projects, but also just the sort of the rewards and the scale of opportunity that's obviously there. So we are going to touch on it again when we look at opportunities later in the presentation, but a few examples that I think you'll be familiar with. Total, and I know we've got a few people from Total signed up for the webinar, but they've got a stated focus on reaching net zero emissions for all of their businesses by 2050. Focus across the globe, but real ambition there. And then in Scotland, we saw just last year Total acquired 51% stake in the Seagreen 1 offshore wind farm, and we actually acted for the lenders and the project financing of the deal. So I remember it very well. It's not a particularly pleasant story from early lockdown, given everything that was involved in that, but it's a great deal to be involved in, and obviously a real marker for Total in Scotland. BP has its own focus on gas and low carbon energy, and just a few specific examples. They obviously partner with Lightsource, solar energy company, developing solar projects across the globe, and their strategic partnership with Equinor in relation to offshore wind is another example. And then finally, on that, I was going to mention Ørsted. Again, you guys probably know all about this, but predominantly a fossil fuel-based business, now completely moved into being a renewables business. That's an extreme example. I realise that, and you might not think that many traditional fossil fuel organisations are going to make a complete transformation, but just to sort of point out, Ørsted have completely transitioned. They're now one of the world's largest offshore wind developers. And then we're obviously talking about fossil fuel-based businesses moving into renewables, and with that in mind, it'd be remiss not to mention the recent round 4 offshore wind leasing auction process for England and Wales. Again, I'm sure there'll be people on this call aware of that. There was only 6 development zones awarded in the process, and of that, 1 successful zone awarded to a consortium of Total and the Green Investment Group, consortium with BP and EnBW successful in 2 zones. So there's 3 zones there already. And actually, if you look at the results of your sort of typically established renewables offshore wind developers, RWE were the only one who were successful in that process. They were awarded 2 zones, and the other kind of traditional key players, if you like, lost out. The option fee structure that was used by the Crown Estate in that process effectively resulted in really high option payments being committed to secure the zones. You've no doubt seen that's drawn quite a lot of criticism in terms of project cost, deliverability, risk of cost being passed on to consumers, things like that. And it actually led to a pause in the Scotland process while the Crown Estate Scotland considered what the implications on their model would be. As I say, I'll touch on that again slightly later in the presentation. We could probably talk all afternoon about electricity generation, and conscious that most of what we said so far centres upon that, but just wanted to mention a few things. Peter's touched on already, but there's so many other elements to the equation in terms of reaching net zero, particularly around decarbonising heat and transport. The reason why there's a focus on the generation side, by and large, that's a market that's developed very well. It's much more mature and understood. But other things just to flag, transport one, Peter mentioned that, electrification of vehicles, all of the required infrastructure to deliver that, bearing in mind Scottish Government commitment to phase out new fossil fuel powered vehicles by 2032, and also looking at alternative fuel sources like hydrogen, LPG for commercial and industrial vehicles. Interesting to see how that develops. Heating is another topic in itself, but there's lots of examples around alternatives to gas boilers. Government have got a plan to ban gas boilers in new homes from 2025, so it's going to be a huge challenge to see how that gets delivered. And then finally, we're seeing sort of continued and increased involvement in emerging technologies and developing areas, so hydrogen, carbon capture, usage and storage, platform electrification, and Peter will touch on a few of those in more detail later. So that kind of covers your focus on the current market, and just moving on from that, we thought it might be useful, particularly with a group of in-house lawyers, to talk through a typical renewables project structure. And you'll see a slide that we've put up there, which looks very, very colourful and interesting. But we use this quite a lot, and it's a really helpful guide. But I mean, one of the reasons for looking at this today is just to kind of dispel any kind of myth that renewables projects are vastly different, in terms of structure from what you might be used to dealing with in the oil and gas sector. So totally understand, and it's totally correct that the regulatory regimes that underpin the sectors and different aspects within them are different. But I guess the point is that typical project or contractual structure generally isn't. The example we're going to look at is an offshore wind project, recognising there's similarities with what you guys will have knowledge of in terms of offshore development. But in general terms, the things that we're going to mention as component parts, they would equally apply to other forms of development, so onshore wind farm, solar projects, etc. what's up on the slide is a sort of general overview of relevant contracts, consents, counterparties involved, that kind of thing. And I'm gonna briefly look at site assembly and development stage, and Peter will then look at construction, support mechanism, financing, operational elements, and that kind of thing. So site assembly and development, what do you need for your project? Obviously, consents. As with any project, you need the appropriate permits and consents from the relevant government body or regulator. Scottish ministers have got responsibility for issuing offshore wind farm consents within both the Scottish territorial waters, which you guys I'm sure will all know, that's 0 to 12 nautical miles, and Scottish offshore waters, so 12 to 200 nautical miles. Thankfully, I'm not a planning lawyer, so I'm not going to go into the detail of the consenting regime, but thought it was worth just drawing out, general terms of relevant consents that you need just to show the kind of level of what's required and the detail. So you need a Section 36 consent that authorises the construction and operation of the wind farm. You need a marine licence in respect to the wind farm, which authorises the deposit of objects and substances in the sea and also the works to construct the wind farm itself. You also need a marine licence in respect to the offshore transmission infrastructure, which we'll explain a bit more about later, but that licence effectively authorises the construction of that infrastructure in the sea. You need a Section 36A declaration, which will extinguish public rights of navigation through the wind farm site. And of course, you need your planning permission in terms of the relevant town and country planning legislation. So that's for your onshore elements of the development, cabling, substation, access roads, etc. If you look at an offshore wind farm, actually the procedure in Scotland for getting your licenses and consents is very different to the rest of the UK. And it is fair to say that the process can be costly and time consuming, probably involves more detail and regulation than what you guys would be used to in terms of an offshore project in the oil and gas sector. But I guess the principle is the same. The principle of needing to get and obtain the relevant consents from the relevant counterparties is the consideration. So you've got your consents, land rights, which is an area which I'm much more familiar with, much more within my domain, being a property lawyer to trade, generally split into offshore documentation and onshore documentation. It's actually a bit counterintuitive, but the offshore property documentation and your actual wind farm lease or leases tend to be a lot more straightforward. Reason for that is that there's very little scope for negotiation with Crown Estate. Basically, documents are what they are. What you have is comprise your wind farm site option and lease or leases, your OFTO option and lease documentation, so that deals with your offshore substation site and your transmission assets, and you may have an anemometry mast license, which deals with wind measuring equipment and property rights for that. Onshore, the land rights tend to involve much more work and actually potentially more costs in terms of assembly and negotiation. And in our experience, obtaining the onshore land rights will normally carry with it more issues with risk and timing, especially when you're trying to get to financial close on a project. Developer would have a fallback of the CPO process if required, but I think what we've seen is that's often a last resort, doesn't carry very good PR, and the result is that developers have to go out and do deals with the cable route landowners to secure the rights, which can be very costly and time consuming, but necessary to get everything done and be able to finance the project. Just sort of briefly covering what the onshore land rights typically comprise. You're going to have your onshore substation site or sites, onshore cable route, typically that crosses a large number of landowners' properties. You need to look at ports and harbours, so property agreements for facilities during construction phase. You probably have an O&M base and offices, so again, you've got your property agreements for onshore facilities for that part of the project. Quite often see crossing agreements, so local authorities, utilities companies, so situations where your cabling is going to cross existing pipes, cables, sewers, roads, etc. And then you need to think about access, so component parts of your turbine will get to the relevant port. Practically speaking, they normally come by ship and they're transferred to the installation vessel at the port, but you may have large substation components and other things. So again, access roads still needs to be taken into account and thought about within the sphere of land rights. So you can see there's still quite a lot to hang together there. And then the third pillar in terms of site assembly and development is grid connection. Generation projects in the UK, they're either connected to the national transmission system or to district networks. Offshore wind projects, because of the size and scale, typically connected to the national transmission system, and we expect that to remain the case going forward. What do you do then? So developer seeks a connection offer from a National Grid Electricity System Operator or National Grid ESO to connect the project to the National Electricity Transmission System. Ownership of that in Scotland split between two transmission operators, the TOs, Scottish and Southern Electricity Networks and SP Energy Networks, and the generator assets will be connected to assets, the transmission assets owned by either of those companies, and whichever one, it just depends on the location of the project, which one has responsibility for that area. Offshore wind projects basically consist of two elements. So you've got your onshore grid connection works and offshore grid connection works. Onshore works undertaken by National Grid ESO that I mentioned and the transmission owner, and the offshore aspects typically constructed by the generator or developer in the first instance, and then what's developed there is a practice that the assets are then adopted by an appointed OFTO following construction. OFTO is the offshore transmission owner. They'll own and operate the transmission infrastructure and assets going forward. Peter's actually going to go, because he's cleverer than I am, he'll tell you a bit more about how the OFTO assets are developed and adopted. That's actually a pretty heavily regulated aspect of the development, but there's a practice evolved there which has been rolled out.
Okay, thanks, Neil. So that's, I think, development rights, getting them in place, getting your project assembly. What I'm going to cover now is just the time where you get on and finance and construct your project once you have de-risked the project with that initial site assembly phase. So at this point, there are a number of kind of key strands that you need to think of in terms of development, and that's principally around subsidy, the contract for difference regime that Neil mentioned, which is it's essentially a price support against volatile power prices that the UK government offer. You therefore then have to find a suitable party to buy the physical electricity. That will be the off-taker under a power purchase agreement. You then appoint the contractors who will construct both the wind farm assets and also the necessary offshore transmission infrastructure and cabling to get the power back to shore, and then finding banks and the level of funding to put the project together. So having worked on all of the projects that are currently in operation or construction in Scottish waters, just to give some context to it, the lending syndicate in each one has provided over £2 billion of finance to developers to allow them to build the project. So again, hopefully that puts into context the size and scale of these projects, the sophistication of them, but also the opportunity for developers, supply chain, and other entities to get involved where there is that sum of money going into a development. It is quite incredible, and we think the next batch of projects in terms of size and scale will be looking at similar lending packages. So to go back then to just the kind of 4 pillars that I was going to cover, the first one is contract for difference, and what that is a government subsidy regime. It's a specific pot that is made available for offshore wind developers. It's also made available to other technologies, but we'll just focus on offshore wind here. But it's made available on an auction basis. There's a finite amount of subsidy available, and developers submit sealed bids of what they require as a strike price for the electricity that they sell. So developers go away, look at their capex, look at their opex, look at what they need as a return, and they need to crunch the numbers to come up with a kind of price for the electricity that they want to receive in return. And that is what they will call their strike price. They will then participate in this auction, and the auction awards contracts from the lowest bid upwards until the whole pot has been distributed. But any bids that kind of in excess of the final accepted bid, they will be deemed unsuccessful and no subsidy will be awarded to those projects. That's a significant risk to any project because lenders require a degree of certainty over the financial returns of the project, obviously. And the CFD is very well established now. Lenders are comfortable with it, developers are comfortable with it. It has achieved its aim. So it is really a key building block of the project to have one. A failure to obtain one in an auction process will often see the developer go back to the drawing board, look at how it can kind of balance its costs, reduce that strike price, and then rebid in coming years. But the issue with that is as more projects are coming forward, they have more time to look at this, more kind of technological advancements. So you will then be bidding against new developers the following year, and it just becomes more and more competitive. So it really is essential for developers in terms of the project timeline to successfully win a CFD that will give them that comfort of power price. But taken alongside the CFD, which is the government subsidy top up, you actually have to sell the power to someone in the first instance. So that's through a power purchase agreement, and that will often have a market price attached to it. That is what the CFD does. It tops up to the difference between the market price and your strike price. So if you have a strike price of £55 and the market price is 45, you'll get 45 from the off-taker and you'll get £10 from government to get you to your 55. It also works the other way, however, if the market price rises above your CFD price, let's say it goes to 65, you then pay the government back the £10 excess. So it just gives you that stable revenue stream that allows lenders and developers to really mark the revenue stream for the project against. So if you have the CFD, you have your off-taker lined up, you have someone looking to buy the power, it's then the kind of financing and the construction. And that, as we've said, is probably it's a complex stage. It has a lot of the same principles as any other renewable energy project or any other project finance. But given the complexity of offshore wind, I think that's where a lot of the risk is built in. You will have your kind of necessary turbine supply agreements, you'll have your delivery agreements, your service and installation, you'll have operation and maintenance contracts. But I think the offshore nature brings a whole multi-level approach here, because you'll then have cable infrastructure contracts, you'll have to deal with the offshore transmission infrastructure, all of which add complexity. You then have to factor in the supply chain for vessels, kind of construction of jackets, bringing jackets, as the case has been, from halfway around the world, the interface around various developers, your various contractors, your ports and harbour agreements, and all of this is sort of underpinned with the need to meet the timescales that are in your grid connection and your CFD. So you all know the kind of weather windows and where one delay can be compounded and it can suddenly get out of hand. And as we've seen with the RSPB judicial review holding up development for 6 to 9 months of these projects, it is quite a tricky, complex stage of the development and requires really robust project management. Looking at how developers have dealt with that on a project management basis, the multi-contract approach has been used rather than EPC type arrangements. And I think the reasons for that have been, it's allowed, I suppose, a reduction in CapEx and OpEx where you're able to tender. It allows a deeper engagement with supply chain. There's a potential scarcity of contractors with the financial capacity and the technical expertise to deliver these projects. So it allows developers to engage more with the supply chain rather than being tied. And it also avoids the need for a consortium, which in many instances has a lot of benefits. But what we've seen here is the joint and several liability aspects of a consortium have been quite tricky with regards to, for example, turbine suppliers who may not be keen on sharing the risk on works that are far outside their scope, where they are delivering turbines, but they're potentially on the hook for cabling, etc. So that's the kind of approach we've seen on the projects we've worked on. And I think to a large extent that has been de-risked. Lenders and developers are now comfortable. It's bringing the cost down. And I think we'll see more of that in the coming projects. Scotland, which we mentioned, I think they'll be developed on a similar basis. And in the financing aspects, as I said, it's £2 billion almost or more per project. Financing has mainly been through syndicates of lenders, and that has often been Japanese banks so far, on the basis that they are getting up to speed and getting familiar with offshore wind and the risks, ready to reinvest in Japanese offshore wind, which I think also highlights just the global market we're playing in. Japanese banks coming here to develop offshore wind, going back to Japan with that expertise. We have projects in North America, projects in mainland Europe. So the sheer scale of the opportunity is global, although we're focusing on Scotland here today. But in terms of the project finance structure, I'm probably oversimplifying it, and I'm not a banking lawyer, as you'll be able to tell, but it is project finance. The size and complexity and scale of the projects are significant, but it involves a lot of the same core principles. Lenders have been heavily engaged in the process. We've acted for lenders on all of the projects so far, so we have been involved in the negotiation of a lot of the underlying contracts and development agreements, the facility agreements, intercreditor agreements, hedging agreements, and then looking at the security package around direct agreements. It's not dissimilar to what you'll have seen in other projects. It's just obviously the subject matter is slightly different. And then the last point I want to touch on is you've reached that point, you've got your finance, you've got your construction, you've signed up all your contracts and the project's been built. It's now the operation point. And Neil mentioned earlier the grid connection arrangements, the need to construct both your actual generation assets and your turbine, as well as the transmission infrastructure. And this is a heavily regulated part because the Electricity Act and EU rules historically have not allowed developers to hold different licenses. You have to hold one or the other. So a developer of a project will have to hold a generation license. They're not then allowed to hold a transmission license. So the transmission assets that are constructed by the developer before operation are then put up for auction by Ofgem and the UK government, which in itself creates a whole new market for different investors. And what we've seen is global infrastructure and investment funds really bidding to win these rights to own and operate the transmission assets. In return, they get a stable, regulated government return on their investment, but they take on and they step into the contracts. They take on the property rights, they take on the construction rights, and they own and operate the transmission assets, which means that the developer at the end is left, although it's constructed everything, it is very much left purely with its turbines and the site assembly and the project generating electricity, and the transmission infrastructure exports that back to shore. Once up and running, I think a project we're looking at a period of 20 to 25 years is where we think it's going to get to at the moment. That has been a mistake that was made in onshore wind, where we thought projects would last 15 to 20 years, and some of them are still running 25 to 30 years. So it remains to be seen kind of the longevity of these projects given the conditions at sea, but we're thinking 20 to 25 years, and that's very much the basis on which these projects are being built at the moment. Hopefully, you can see from that overview of the different component parts that although it's underpinned by different regulatory regimes and slightly different complexity as to how it's put together, it does involve the coordination of the same component parts that you'd really consider for any project with regards to property, planning, construction, financing, etc. So I do hope you found that useful, particularly from a legal perspective and understanding the contract structure with our very colourful slide that we have. But in the last section, I think what we want to do is just finish the session with that knowledge, looking at the opportunities and challenges in the sector as we go forward. We'll start with offshore wind, which is the most obvious, and we've touched on some of it before. And then I can highlight some of the other opportunities and challenges that are presented by energy transition and some emerging technologies.
Thanks, Peter. I'm just going to take a look at the offshore wind and the Scotland stuff first. So we already mentioned that it's clear that Scotland is going to be a significant opportunity for those involved in the oil and gas sector. Looking at that both from the point of view of larger players who seek to get involved in project development, and that's obviously what we've seen with the round 4 auction results in England and Wales that I mentioned. But also opportunities arising from the supply chain side. If you bear in mind the number of projects that the Scottish Government wants to see coming forward from the Scotland process, and obviously beyond. And to achieve the climate change goals, it's clear project development can't take as long as the last batch of projects took to get from inception through to operation. So I remember the likes of NNG, they were looking at that, working on that sort of 2008, 2009, 2010, and it reached financial close 2018. So that's too long if you look at where the government wants to get to, what the targets are. And so we expect route to market on projects and the frequency of leasing rounds actually to improve and indeed increase. What they've said about the current leasing round is they're aiming to deliver another 8 to 10 gigawatts of offshore wind. Scottish capacity target increasing from 18 to 20 gigawatts, and the bulk of which they want to deliver 2027 to 2032. So lots to be done, but lots to play for. And it's worth mentioning as well, Scotland in particular is looking to develop expertise to be a world leader in floating offshore technology. So we expect a lot on that as well. I mean, from our perspective, it's going to be really interesting to see what the outcome of the first Scotland auction is. I mentioned that it had been delayed so they could consider the implications of the round 4 results. What it led to was Crown Estate Scotland, amongst other things, increasing the proposed maximum level of option fees that a bidder would have to commit to. And one of our clients commented to us that basically puts an extra 0 on the end of the cost that they've been planning for. So again, as I say, really interesting to see how the results play out. There's 15 zones that have been identified through Scotland, and closing date for applications for that 16th of July 2021. So it won't be too long before we see what the results are. Mentioned the supply chain perspective. You guys, I think, will be aware there's been a lot of attention paid to this, a lot of talk about how the process can best facilitate involvement of local companies in the offshore wind projects going forward. There's been a lot of high-profile discussion and attention arising out of the BIFAB situation. That's obviously been well publicised over the last couple of years and plays into the thinking around this. They had spoken about sort of binding commitments to a level of local content being included both within the bids in Scotland and also the subsequent contractual documentation. I mean, where they've ended up, and we suspect that this is around concerns about enforceability of provisions and probably procurement and competition law considerations. What they've ended up with is requirement for a supply chain development statement. That is ultimately going to form part of a developer's contractual obligations through their option and lease, but the commitments are not part of the bid assessment. And as a result of that, remains to be seen the approach that the bidders are going to take and what they're willing to commit to or otherwise. Obviously, the current applicable local market for supply chain elements needs a lot of investment and development. So there's a lot of work to be done there. But we do think it's a commendable position to be in, that there's movement towards trying to get as much of the supply chain as possible sourced in Scotland and the rest of the UK. But it needs significant government involvement, investment in terms of skills development, training, and that sort of thing. On that, I mean, we've seen in recent times there's the UK offshore wind sector deal between government and the offshore wind industry, looking to increase productivity, competitiveness of supply chain, target of 60% UK content by 2030. And they carry with that stated ambitions and looking at things like increasing generation capacity, increasing investment in UK infrastructure, reducing costs to consumers, a big part of it, and also large increase in skilled jobs is what they're seeking to deliver. What they've done in Scotland, the Scottish Offshore Wind Energy Council created, and they're set up what they call these dedicated clusters of companies coming together to try and help improve where we're going with this. So there's a Forth and Tay cluster, there's a Deep Wind cluster, and basically each looking to kind of enhance local content and projects, and they want to help organisations build their presence in the offshore wind supply chain, both in the domestic and international market. So, they're doing a lot of good work, and certainly, any organisations with an interest in being part of that would recommend that they join those clusters and look to see what the benefits they get from their from perspective of being involved in oil and gas sector work. Therefore, I mean, clear opportunity to diversify skills and knowledge in terms of the development of offshore wind. I think what we see is that in many ways a lot of process will be familiar and be similar. So whether it's use of vessels, cabling, pipelines, health and safety regime, that sort of thing, there is a lot there that I guess, as I say, will be be similar and undoubtedly transferable knowledge and expertise. Challenges to achieving that, of course, there is. You need to build and develop relationships with developers and tier 1 contractors, and that's what the kind of clusters are trying to help promote and develop. There's also, you know, competition from around the globe, which is what we've seen with the projects that have come online so far. And developers, you need to consider developers are looking at project economics and what's the competitive advantage, and that's going to play into thinking a lot. But we're moving in the right direction, and I think what we try to demonstrate is a sector with tremendous ambition and clear political support. And as a result of that, our view certainly is that there'll be a number of companies looking at where their own angle might lie to move into the space and maximise their involvement going forward. And I will finish off passing over to Peter to look at a few other areas of opportunity.
Thanks, Neil. So I think it's just looking beyond the immediate opportunity of offshore wind that Neil's highlighted, and perhaps going back to where we started on the energy transition, it is clear that oil and gas and renewable sectors are becoming more heavily intertwined, both with the types of projects and also the kind of crossover of key clients or key companies in both sectors. There are a few technologies where this is very much the case that can deploy assets and expertise from both sectors. We could present for a whole hour on hydrogen itself. That's very much the current sector buzzword. There's a lot of people excited about the potential for hydrogen, but two sectors I just wanted to pick up on here is carbon capture and storage and platform electrification, where we've been doing some work in both. Both sectors there form key pillars alongside offshore wind and hydrogen in the UK government's energy transition agenda. They are exciting with terms of their potential, and I assume that you're all familiar with both. But if not, in simple form, CCS is the capture of carbon emissions, transporting them from source via pipelines, storing to subsea wells, and platform electrification is electrification of existing and new oil and gas platforms using either a connection from the shore or from on-site or nearby offshore wind farms. And we've highlighted already that the structure and component parts of offshore wind projects are really no different from the considerations that need to be given to other types of development. And we very much approach CCS and platform electrification in the same way. There is a will and a commitment to develop these projects. There's technology there to do it. And there are frameworks in place that take us some way to getting there. As we've highlighted, the Crown Estate role, Marine Scotland, government support, etc. But I think our concern and the challenge that we highlight is this is another, I think, prime example where technology has moved quicker than regulation, and UK government caught up in issues around COVID and Brexit and IndyRef, which will come down the line soon, I imagine. Attention hasn't really been given in the way it should have to have developed these structures by now. But in terms of both CCS and platform electrification, we will deploy elements of both renewable energy expertise and oil and gas expertise. Neil touched on those there with regards to installation of cabling and pipelines, working in and around existing assets, using powers under the Marine Scotland Act or the Pipeline Works Authorisation, use of vessels, offshore contracting, health and safety. They really do represent a huge opportunity in the whole energy transition to make advancements in reducing our carbon emissions. And also developing entirely new sectors for companies and supply chain to operate in. And if we look at offshore wind as an example of its success in developing an entirely new sector, it did involve trial and error. The OFTO regime that I mentioned was in many ways ripped up and restarted from what was initially envisaged because it just didn't work. It wasn't fit for purpose as they thought it would be. The CFD process has got it right for some projects, but not all. Judicial review processes launched over consenting delayed projects by a number of years. All of these things were hiccups along the way, but have been overcome by UK government and Scottish government and developers to give us a world-leading offshore wind programme. I think with political will, strong regulatory frameworks, willing investors and developers, there's no reason to expect this can't be achieved with CCS and platform electrification. But we find ourselves in a tricky position where developers are ready to embrace it, but not entirely confident in the long-term, I guess, viability and regulatory environment that needs to underpin such significant investments. But we witnessed this a few years ago with battery storage projects in the UK in a renewable sense. The technology was there, land and planning rights were similar to solar, connection to the grid was straightforward, but UK government just couldn't put in place quickly enough a stable regulatory framework that allowed investors to really go forward with battery storage. An opportunity was definitely missed there, although we're seeing an increasing amount of it now. This is 5 or 6 years ago that we heard a lot of talk about it, and I think there are strong parallels with the fact that hydrogen and CCS and things are coming up at every conference, they're on every agenda, but we just really do need to see the government move this forward. In many ways, it can't be allowed to happen with energy transition technologies. I think, again, going back to the beginning where we talked about political will and how high up net zero and climate change is in the agenda, COP26 being held this year in Glasgow, I think that the industry and government are focused on it. And I think COVID, again, has shown us what needs to be done with kind of strong policies, perhaps extreme policies, changing behaviours, introducing financial support. And I think all of these things have been highlighted in the last 12 months. And I think the government really do need to apply some of these principles to ensure that we don't miss the opportunities that are there with things like CCS, platform electrification, and hydrogen. I think that hopefully takes us neatly, or crudely, as Neil will probably say, back to where we started with our commentary that the energy sector is in a kind of state of flux. The energy transition is very much underway, and the oil and gas sectors and renewable sectors are more closely aligned than ever, both in terms of the key players, but also in terms of the complementary technologies and the joint projects that we see coming in the next decade. We really hope you found this useful. I think we'll sum it up there. Hopefully that was a whistle-stop tour of a renewables project and the current sector, and giving you some food for thought and what the opportunities and challenges are. And we very much welcome any questions that anyone has on any of the 3 sections that we covered. And if not raising it in this forum, then please feel free to drop us an email, and we're more than happy to engage and continue the conversation. So thanks.
That's great. Thanks, Peter and Neil. Lots of really good information there on renewable energy projects and where the opportunities lie for the oil and gas sector. So as I mentioned at the start, we're now going to move on to our Q&A session, conscious that we don't have a huge amount of time. But if you do have any questions for Peter and Neil, please feel free to send them in via the chat function now. We have actually had a couple that have come through just while the presentations were going on. So to kick us off, right, Peter, Neil, how feasible is it from your perspective that there will be an adequate Scottish or UK-based supply chain able to deliver the next batch of offshore wind projects that you spoke about?
Neil? Neil, you're on mute. There's always one.
I'm just testing you there. See, actually, I was worried that I was going to get interrupted by a small child at some point, but thankfully that's not a problem. Yeah, it's a difficult one. I think we've been sceptical about it to some extent, and I think a lot of developers were worried about the whole local content requirements, particularly when you go so far offshore and you lose the sort of competitive advantage of wind resource. We've spoken about this before, and connection charges for projects elsewhere in the UK, for example, might be a lot less, meaning that Scottish projects will struggle to compete, might struggle to get CFDs and struggle to get away. So there was nervousness about that. I mean, I think there's a lot of good moves being made to try and address it, but it's something that's going to be difficult to achieve, in my opinion. If you look at BiFab as an example, there's been a lot of kind of uproar and a lot of negative comment and a lot of bad publicity about that. But the reality is, and I know, we'd spoken to people that in the sector and industry frankly, the yards could not have, in my understanding was they just couldn't have delivered what was required. They weren't able to do it. So that the developer EDF in that case were in the position they were in, and they had to go and source what they did at the rates they did. So it's not ready to be in that stage, but hopefully that there will be moves made, and there is a lot of potential projects on the horizon that will necessitate it. The Scottish Government are making a lot of the right noises about it, and I think it's up to them and the industry to deliver.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think I mentioned the CFD and the need to submit a strike price. That strike price has to take into account your CapEx and your OpEx and everything else. And I think that's what developers had seen to date, is they're trying, there's an element of, and well, there always has been in renewables, to drive down costs. And there is a need to drive down costs. And I think that was a large part of the decision made by developers who maybe went with international supply chain entities for their offshore projects. Was we need two things. We need to be able to do it at a cost that works. We can't overinflate the price just for local supply chain, but we also need comfort on the delivery of the supply chain. And I think that historically has been the stumbling block, that some of the developers just weren't comfortable with the prices and tenders being submitted by Scottish supply chain, and also the size and scale of the supply chain available. And I mentioned just things like weather windows and delays, where you have the complexity of that contractual framework. A failure in the supply chain can have a really significant detrimental impact to the whole project program. So it is, I think, a missed opportunity in terms of when the offshore wind projects that are now being built or going into operation were conceived 10 years ago, that more wasn't done then to bolster the supply chain and invest in the supply chain by Scottish Government. But I think lessons have been learned, and there are really good moves into that to ensure that the Scottish supply chain doesn't lose out this time with regards to ScotWind in the way that it perhaps lost out last time.
Brilliant, thank you guys. So we've got one more question, so maybe try and make this one quick one. You mentioned round 4 in England and the success that oil and gas companies had in that. How do you think that's going to impact the ScotWind process, given that a number of traditional offshore wind developers were unsuccessful?
I think it will have a really big impact. If you look at just even offshore wind, what we are seeing, Neil mentioned traditional developers, the batch of projects currently in development, there's very much a small pool of offshore wind developers who are developing the current projects, which is SSE, Ørsted, RWE, Scottish Power, EDF, and a few others. Those entities lost out in the auction process. I think, as Neil said, RWE were maybe the only one that was successful in round 4. So round 4 was always going to be competitive, and ScotWind was always going to be competitive. We knew before round 4 that we were going to have new entrants to the market from the oil and gas sector. We were going to have the traditional offshore wind developers in the UK or in Europe. And we were also going to have a lot of developers who were going into consortiums with technology manufacturers, turbine manufacturers, who are maybe more traditional onshore wind developers. But as the cost of offshore wind has fallen, as the risks are now well understood, a lot more developers were entering the market because they feel that they can do this, because they now understand the market. So you had these 3 classes of kind of companies going into the rounds, and what's happened is round 4 has been successful for a very small number of companies. So there will be and again, given how long it takes to develop the projects, it is a sort of, it will be 6 to 8 years, we think. There's a lot of companies with offshore wind aspirations that really can't afford to lose out in ScotWind. So I think for that reason, it's going to make it really interesting, and it's going to make it really competitive, because I think for a lot of these companies, I mean, to even get to the bidding stage, you're talking 6-figure sums. There's a lot that's gone into this so far. So I think the impact is we're going to see some really interesting bids and some really interesting projects. And I hope what we get from it is a real mixture of developers, both the oil and gas, traditional renewables, and a lot of the new developers who want to get into the sector. And I think that would be a success. And with 15 projects or 15 zones up for grabs, that would be brilliant.
That's great. Thank you very much. Well, I think that's probably all we've got time for on the questions, but if anyone does have any questions that come up after the session today is over, please do get in touch with Peter and Neil. They've said it before, they're more than happy to answer those. So I think I'm just going to conclude by thanking you all for your attendance this afternoon, and a special thank you to Peter and Neil for their time and their excellent presentation. I'm sure you all really enjoyed it. I certainly felt I learned a lot. So just as a quick reminder, our final webinar in our Oil and Gas Lunchtime series is going to be taking place tomorrow at 12:30, where we'll be hearing from Lynn Moss and Andrew Knight. Lynn and Andrew are going to be covering where we are now in terms of COVID vaccinations and reopening of workplaces. They're also going to be discussing your health and safety obligations in relation to COVID safe workplaces and the legal risks of making vaccinations mandatory for your staff. So if you haven't already signed up for that session and you would like to do so, I think there should be a link in the chat function, so you'll be able to sign up that way. So hopefully we'll see you tomorrow, but thank you so much for attending today, and have a good afternoon, everyone. Thank you.